The morning sun painted the mountains gold, but Chief Theron felt no warmth in his heart. He stood on the highest tower of his village, watching the horizon with worried eyes. For 3 generations his family had protected these lands. The Kalar tribe had known peace for so long that some of the younger warriors had never seen real battle. But peace was about to end. A scout came running up the stone steps, breathing hard. His name was Jorik, one of their fastest riders. The sweat on his face told a story before he even spoke. "Chief, they're coming," Jorik gasped. "More soldiers than I've ever seen. They move like a black cloud across the eastern plains. Their flags show no mercy." Theron's jaw tightened. He had heard whispers of this army for weeks. They called themselves the Iron Fist, and they had already destroyed 3 villages to the east. No one knew exactly what they wanted, but they took everything and left nothing behind. "How many?" the chief asked. "Thousands, my lord. Maybe 5,000. They have horses, weapons that shine like silver, and machines of war I don't recognize." The chief closed his eyes for a moment. His own tribe had maybe 800 people, and only 200 were trained fighters. The math was not in their favor. Within an hour, the great hall filled with voices. The tribal council sat in a circle, their faces grave. These were the wisest men and women of the Kalar people. They had guided the tribe through droughts, harsh winters, and small conflicts with neighbors. But nothing like this. "We should leave," said Elder Bram, his white beard shaking as he spoke. "Pack what we can carry and head to the northern mountains. The caves there could hide us until winter comes. These invaders will move on to easier targets." "And abandon our ancestors' graves?" asked Elder Nira, her voice sharp. "Leave the temples where our children pray? This land has been ours for 300 years. The argument continued for an hour. Some wanted to fight, others wanted to flee. Some suggested sending messengers to ask for help from other tribes, but that would take weeks they didn't have. Outside the hall, Arya pressed her ear to the wooden door. As the chief's daughter, she was not allowed in war councils, but she had every right to know what would happen to her people. At 22, she had grown up hearing stories of her grandfather's battles. She knew the old strategies, the secret paths through the mountains, and every hiding place in their territory. Her heart raced as she listened to the debate inside. These old men were thinking with fear, not wisdom. Running away would only delay the problem. The Iron Fist would catch them in the mountains where they had no defenses at all. "They're making a mistake," she whispered to herself. A horse's hooves echoed in the courtyard. Arya looked through the window and saw a stranger dismounting. He was tall but not giant, with dark hair and clothes that showed he had traveled far. His horse was tired and dust covered his leather boots. The stranger walked straight to the guards at the hall entrance. "I need to speak with your chief immediately," he said. His voice was calm but urgent. "It's about the army heading your way." "The council is in session," one guard replied. "No one enters." "Then people will die because of your rules," the stranger said simply. "I've been tracking this army for 2 weeks. I know their plans, their weaknesses, and how they fight. Your chief needs this information now, not after his meeting ends." Something in the man's tone made the guards look at each other. Finally, one knocked on the hall door. Chief Theron appeared moments later, his face showing the stress of command. "Who are you?" "My name is Kalen. I come from the Windbrook tribe, 2 days' ride north of here. The Iron Fist destroyed a village near our borders last month. I've been following them ever since, learning how they work." The chief studied Kalen's face. The young man's eyes were steady, without fear or deception. "What do you know?" "They attack at dawn, always from the east. They use fire arrows to panic people, then charge with heavy cavalry. But they're not as smart as they think. They rely on fear more than skill. I've seen them make mistakes." Theron was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the hall door wider. "Come inside." The council members looked up in surprise as the stranger entered their sacred meeting space. Some frowned at this break in tradition, but Chief Theron raised his hand for silence. "This man has information we need," the chief announced. Kalen walked to the center of the circle, unafraid of all the eyes watching him. He had faced worse things than a room full of worried elders. "The Iron Fist moves fast, but they don't plan well for defense," he began. "They expect to win quickly and move on. If you can make them stay and fight longer than they want, they start making bigger mistakes." "How do you know all this?" Elder Bram asked suspiciously. "Because I've been hunting them," Kalen replied. "They killed my younger brother in their last attack. I swore an oath to make them pay." The room fell silent. Everyone understood the weight of such an oath. "What do you suggest?" Chief Theron asked. "Stand and fight, but fight smart. Use your knowledge of this land. Make them come to you where you're strongest, not where they're comfortable. Outside, Arya felt her heart skip. Finally, someone was talking sense. This stranger understood what the elders were missing. Running away was not always the safest choice. The debate continued, but now it had new energy. Kalen answered every question with clear, detailed knowledge. He drew maps in the dirt, showing exactly where the Iron Fist would probably attack. He explained their formation, their timing, and their weaknesses. As the sun began to set, Chief Theron made his decision. "We fight," he announced. "We make our stand here on our own land." Some council members nodded with determination. Others looked worried but accepted their chief's choice. "And you," Theron said to Kalen, "will you stay to help us?" "You have no obligation to our people." Kalen stood straight. "I came here to warn you. But if you're willing to fight, then yes, I'll stay. This army needs to be stopped somewhere, and your people deserve a chance." As the council meeting ended, Arya stepped back from the door. Her mind raced with thoughts and possibilities. This stranger, this Kalen, had just changed everything. For the first time since the scouts brought their terrible news, she felt something that wasn't fear. She felt hope. The war for their homeland was about to begin. The next morning came too quickly. Chief Theron stood in the training grounds watching his warriors prepare for battle. Some sharpened their swords with steady hands while others checked their armor with nervous energy. The reality of war was settling in, and not everyone looked ready. Kalen walked among the fighters, observing their skills and equipment. What he saw worried him. Many of these men had never fought anything more dangerous than wild animals. Their weapons were good for hunting, but war was different. War was about killing other men who were trying to kill you first. "Chief," Kalen said quietly, pulling Theron aside, "we need to talk." They walked away from the others, finding privacy near the old stone wall that surrounded the village center. "Your men are brave," Kalen began carefully, "but bravery alone won't stop the Iron Fist. They need more training, and we don't have much time." Theron's face showed his frustration. "These are good people. Hunters, farmers, craftsmen. They'll fight for their families. I know they will. But fighting for family and knowing how to fight are two different things. The Iron Fist has professional soldiers. They've been training for war since they were children." The chief looked back at his people. His nephew Davin was practicing sword moves he had learned from his grandfather. Young Tam was struggling to adjust armor that was too big for him. These weren't warriors. They were ordinary people forced into an impossible situation. "What do you suggest?" Theron asked. "Let me train them. I know how the enemy fights. I can teach your men to counter their tactics. But I need full authority to change how they do things." The chief was quiet for a long moment. Giving a stranger command over his warriors went against every tradition. But traditions wouldn't stop arrows or swords. "You have it," Theron decided. "Do whatever needs to be done." As the day progressed, Kalen began working with small groups of fighters. He showed them how to move as a unit, how to use shields together, and how to create defensive formations that could stop cavalry charges. "Forget everything you know about honor and battle," he told them. "The Iron Fist doesn't fight with honor. They fight to win, and they'll use any advantage they can get. You need to think the same way." Some of the older warriors grumbled about taking orders from an outsider, but they couldn't argue with Kalen's knowledge. He had seen the enemy fight. He knew their tricks and their weaknesses. From her window in the chief's house, Arya watched the training sessions with growing interest. She had learned swordplay from her father's old instructor, but only as exercise, not real combat training. Now she wished she had paid more attention to those lessons. That evening, she made a decision that would have shocked her father. She waited until the training grounds were empty, then slipped out wearing her brother's old clothes. The practice swords were still lying where the warriors had left them. She picked one up, feeling the weight of it in her hands. "You're holding it wrong." Arya spun around, heart pounding. Kalen stood in the shadows near the armory, watching her with calm eyes. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," she said quickly, dropping the sword. "Yes, you were. Your grip was too tight and your stance was off balance. If you're going to practice with weapons, you should learn to do it properly." Arya felt her face grow hot. "Women aren't supposed to fight. I was just curious." Kalen stepped into the moonlight. "In my tribe, everyone learns to fight. Women, men, even children old enough to hold a blade. When your enemies don't care about your traditions can become weaknesses." He picked up the sword she had dropped and handed it back to her. "Show me what you know." For the next hour, Kalen taught Arya basic fighting techniques. He was patient but honest, correcting her mistakes without making her feel stupid. By the end of the lesson, she was sweating and tired, but she felt stronger than she had all day. "Why are you helping us?" she asked as they put the weapons away. "You could have just warned us and left. You don't owe our people anything." Kaylin was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars. "The Iron Fist will keep moving from village to village until someone stops them. If they win here, they'll attack my people next. Better to stop them now with help than face them alone later." "Is that the only reason?" He looked at her then, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "No," he said simply. "It's not." The next morning brought troubling news. 3 more warriors had decided to leave with their families during the night. They had taken the mountain path north, hoping to reach safety before the Iron Fist arrived. Chief Theron tried to hide his disappointment, but Arya could see it in his eyes. Each person who left made their defense weaker. "Let them go," Kaylin said when the chief told him about the deserters. Frightened fighters are more dangerous to their own side than to the enemy, but the losses stung. The Kalar tribe now had fewer than 150 people who could fight, and many of those were barely trained. "We need an advantage," Theron said during their daily strategy meeting, something they won't expect. Kaylin nodded. "I have some ideas, but they'll require using every resource we have, including people who aren't traditionally fighters." The chief knew he was talking about the women and older children. In desperate times, desperate measures became necessary. "What do you need?" "Your daughter knows these lands better than anyone, doesn't she? I've seen her watching our training sessions. She understands tactics." Theron's expression darkened. "Arya is not going to fight. She doesn't have to fight. But she could help with strategy. She knows secret paths, hidden caves, places where we could store supplies or set ambushes. That knowledge could save lives." The argument that followed was heated but brief. In the end, necessity won over tradition. Arya was brought into their planning sessions, and her knowledge of the local terrain proved invaluable. She showed them caves that could hide their elderly and children. She mapped out escape routes that only the Kalar people knew. Most importantly, she identified places where a small force could hold off a much larger army. "There's a narrow pass called Eagle's Gate," she explained, drawing in the dirt with a stick. "It's the fastest way to reach our village from the east." But only 10 men could walk through it side by side. Kaylin studied her rough map. "If we could force them to come through there, we could hold them off with a fraction of our forces," Theron finished, understanding the strategy immediately. For the first time since this crisis began, the chief felt a spark of real hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. As the war council ended that night, Kaylin and Arya found themselves walking together toward the village center. The night was clear and stars filled the sky above their mountain home. "Do you really think we can win?" she asked quietly. Kaylin didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was honest. "I think we can make them pay such a high price that they'll think twice about attacking other innocent people." It wasn't exactly a promise of victory, but it was something better than false hope. It was truth, and truth was something Arya could build her courage on. The Iron Fist would arrive soon, but when they did, they would find the Kalar people ready to fight for everything they loved. 5 days remained before the Iron Fist would reach their lands. The village had transformed from a peaceful farming community into a fortress preparing for war. Every person, from the youngest teenager to the oldest grandmother, had a role to play in their defense. Kaylin worked from sunrise to sunset, training the warriors in techniques they had never imagined needing. He taught them how to fight as a group instead of individual heroes. He showed them dirty tricks that could save their lives, how to trip a charging horse, where to strike an armored opponent, and how to use their environment as a weapon. "Forget about fair fighting," he told a group of young men who still thought war was glorious. "Your enemy wants to kill you and take everything you love. Use rocks, use dirt in their eyes, use anything that gives you an advantage." Some of the older warriors initially resisted these teachings. They had grown up hearing stories of honorable single combat and noble battles, but Kaylin's quiet authority and obvious expertise gradually won them over. "Honor is staying alive to protect your family," he said during one particularly difficult training session. "Dead heroes can't defend anyone." Tam, the youngest fighter at barely 16, struggled more than the others. His hands shook when he held his sword and he jumped at loud noises. After the 3rd time he dropped his weapon during practice, Some of the other men started muttering that he should stay with the children and elderly. Kalen pulled Tam aside that afternoon. "Walk with me," he said simply. They left the training ground and climbed up to the old watchtower that overlooked the valley. From there, they could see the smoke from cooking fires in distant villages, the winding river that brought life to their lands, and the mountain peaks that had guarded the Kalar people for generations. "Tell me what you see," Kalen said. Tam looked confused. "I see our valley, the river, the mountains, and what else?" The young man studied the landscape more carefully. "The mill where my father works. The fields where we grow our grain. The pastures where our animals graze." "That's right. And who takes care of all those places?" "We do, our people," Kalen nodded. "The Iron Fist wants to destroy all of that. Not because they need it, but because they can. They'll burn the mill, poison the river, and scatter the animals to die. They'll do it because they enjoy causing pain." Tam's hands had stopped shaking. His young face hardened with determination. "I won't let them," he said quietly. "Good. Now let's go practice some more." Meanwhile, Arya had convinced her father to let her organize the non-combatants. She moved the children, elderly and wounded, to the safest caves in the mountains. She helped coordinate food supplies and medical preparations. Most importantly, she worked with the other women to create backup plans for every possible disaster. "If the main defense fails," she explained to a group of mothers and wives, "we need to be ready to take the children deeper into the mountains. I know paths that even our own scouts don't use. We can survive up there for months if necessary." But privately, she was making different preparations. Late at night, when everyone else was asleep, she practiced with the weapons Kalen had shown her. She studied the battle plans and memorized every detail of their defensive strategy. Her father would be furious if he knew, but Arya had no intention of hiding in a cave while her people fought and died. She had skills that could help, and she refused to waste them because of old traditions about women not fighting. The village blacksmith, a tough old man named Henrik, worked day and night making arrowheads and sharpening weapons. His forge glowed like a star in the darkness, and the ring of his hammer became the village's heartbeat. "We'll need more arrows than you think," Kalen told him during one of their planning sessions. "The Iron Fist uses heavy armor. Most arrows will bounce off unless they hit exactly the right spots." Henrik nodded grimly. "I'm making special points, longer and sharper. They'll punch through armor at close range. How many can you make? 500, maybe 600 by the time they arrive." It wasn't enough for a long battle, but it would have to do. Kalen made a mental note to plan tactics that didn't rely heavily on archery. 3 days before the expected attack, their scouts brought disturbing news. The Iron Fist was moving faster than anticipated. They had struck a village only 1 day's march away, destroying it completely before continuing their advance. Worse, they had captured some of the survivors and were forcing them to guide the army through the local terrain. The enemy would now know about some of the secret paths and hidden approaches that the Kalar people had planned to use as advantages. "We need to change our strategy," Chief Theron said during an emergency council meeting. Kalen studied the maps they had drawn of the surrounding area. "Not change, adapt. We can still use the terrain to our advantage, but we'll need to be more creative about it." He pointed to a series of ridges that overlooked the main approach to their village. "If we can't surprise them with hidden paths, we'll surprise them with something else. We'll make them think we're weaker than we are." "How?" "We let them see a small force defending the obvious approaches. While they're focused on that, our main force hits them from an unexpected direction." It was risky. If the timing went wrong, they could end up with their fighters scattered and unable to support each other. But it was better than trying to match a superior force in a straight battle. Arya listened to these discussions with growing excitement and fear. The reality of war was becoming clear to everyone. People were going to die. Families would be broken. Their peaceful way of life would end forever, regardless of who won the battle. That night she found Kalen sitting alone near the village well, staring up at the stars. He looked tired and worried, though he tried to hide it during the day. "Do you ever doubt that we're doing the right thing?" she asked, sitting beside him on the stone wall. "Every day," he admitted. "But doubt doesn't change what's necessary. Sometimes the only choice is between fighting and surrender isn't always the safer option." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of their mountain home. An owl called from the forest. The wind whispered through the pine trees. It was peaceful, and both of them knew this might be their last quiet moment for a long time. "Kaylin," Arya said finally, "I want to ask you something, but I need you to be completely honest." He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "Always. Do we really have a chance of winning?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "We have a chance of making them regret coming here. We have a chance of saving some of our people. We have a chance of showing them that the Kalar tribe won't be conquered easily. But winning means different things to different people. If winning means driving them away and going back to the way things were before, then no, that's probably not going to happen." He paused, then continued more gently. "But if winning means protecting what matters most and making sure our people survive to see another generation, then yes, we have a very good chance of that." It wasn't the answer she had hoped for, but it was the truth. And somehow the truth was more comforting than false promises would have been. 2 more days of preparation remained. Everyone in the village could feel the approaching storm. Children played quieter games. Adults worked with focused intensity. Even the animals seemed to sense that something was coming. Kaylin spent those final days making sure everyone knew their role in the battle plan. He walked among the warriors, offering encouragement and last-minute advice. He checked the defensive positions and made final adjustments to their strategy. But most importantly, he made sure that every person, fighter or not, understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. They weren't just defending a village. They were defending their right to live free, to raise their children in peace, and to practice the traditions that made them who they were. The Iron Fist would arrive soon. When they did, they would discover that the Kalar people were not the easy victims they expected to find. The attack came at dawn, just as Kaylin had predicted. The first sign was a low rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. Then the war horns sounded, deep, terrible notes that echoed off the mountain walls and sent chills through everyone who heard them. Arya was in the watchtower when she first saw them. A dark line appeared on the eastern horizon, growing larger and more defined by the minute. Hundreds of horses, thousands of men on foot, and the gleam of metal weapons catching the early morning sun. "Signal the others," she called down to the boy stationed below. Within moments, the village bells began ringing in the pattern that meant immediate danger. The Iron Fist moved like a machine designed for destruction. Their cavalry rode in perfect formation. Their infantry marched in disciplined rows, and their siege engines rolled forward on massive wheels. This was not a raiding party or a group of bandits. This was an army that had conquered many villages before reaching the Kalar lands. Chief Theron stood on the village walls, watching the approaching force with grim determination. His own fighters were hidden in the positions Kaylin had chosen for them. Everything depended on timing now. "Remember," he called to the few men visible on the walls, "let them see you, but don't let them count you accurately. We want them to think we have more defenders than we actually do." The Iron Fist stopped just outside arrow range and began setting up their camp. Their commander, a tall man in black armor, rode forward with a small group of his officers. He carried a white banner, the traditional sign for a parley. Theron met them at the main gate, accompanied by 2 of his oldest warriors. The enemy commander removed his helmet, revealing a scarred face and cold gray eyes. "I am General Vex of the Iron Fist," he announced in a voice that carried clearly in the morning air. "You have something that belongs to us." "These are our ancestral lands," Theron replied firmly. "Nothing here belongs to you." Vex smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Everything we can take belongs to us. That's how the world works. But I'm feeling generous today, so I'll give you a choice. Surrender now. Give us half your food and treasure, and we'll let your people live as our servants. Refuse, and we'll take everything anyway after we kill anyone who resists." "We choose to resist." The general's smile disappeared. "Then you choose death. We'll attack at midday. Use the time to say goodbye to your families." As the enemy delegation rode back to their camp, Theron felt a moment of doubt. The Iron Fist had more men than he had ever seen in one place. Their equipment was better, their training was superior, and their experience in battle was written in the confident way they moved. But when he looked back at his own people, he saw something the Iron Fist didn't have. He saw men and women fighting for their homes, their children, and their way of life. He saw faces filled with determination instead of greed. Kaylin appeared at his side, moving silently as always. "They're trying to intimidate us with their show of force. But look closer. They're tired from their march and they're overconfident. Those are advantages we can use. The hours before the attack crawled by like days. Warriors checked their weapons one final time. Families said goodbye to each other, not knowing if they would meet again. Children were moved to the deepest, safest caves in the mountains. Arya had convinced her father to let her coordinate communications between the different defensive positions. She carried messages back and forth, but her real purpose was to stay close to the battle. If things went badly, she was determined to fight rather than hide. At midday exactly, the Iron Fist attacked. They came in waves, just as Kaelin had predicted. First, a shower of fire arrows designed to cause panic and confusion. The Kalar defenders had prepared for this. Wet blankets and sand buckets were ready to put out any fires quickly. Then came the cavalry charge, designed to break through the main gate and create chaos inside the village. But the gate held, reinforced with every piece of metal and wood the villagers could find. The horses crashed against it like waves against a stone cliff. "Now!" Kaelin shouted from his position on the wall. The real defense began. Archers hidden in carefully prepared positions sent a rain of arrows down on the attackers. The special arrowheads Henrik had forged punched through armor and found their targets. Men and horses fell, creating obstacles for those behind them. But the Iron Fist was experienced in siege warfare. They adapted quickly, raising shields and changing their tactics. Their own archers began targeting the defenders on the walls, forcing them to take cover. The battle raged for hours. The attackers tried different approaches, scaling ladders, a battering ram, even an attempt to set fire to the wooden sections of the wall. Each attack was met with fierce resistance, but each also cost the defenders precious fighters they couldn't afford to lose. By afternoon, it was clear that the village walls wouldn't hold much longer. The Iron Fist had brought up their siege engines, and the massive stones they hurled were starting to crack the ancient stonework. "We need to fall back to the second position," Kaelin told Chief Theron during a brief lull in the fighting. "If we try to hold the outer walls much longer, we'll lose too many people." Theron nodded reluctantly. The outer village would be lost, but the people could still be saved if they retreated to the more defensible inner walls around the village center. The withdrawal was the most dangerous part of the battle. Moving fighters from one position to another while under attack required perfect timing and iron discipline. Some men panicked and ran too early, leaving gaps in the defense. Others stayed too long and barely escaped with their lives. During the confusion of the retreat, disaster struck. A group of Iron Fist soldiers had found a way through a section of wall that had been damaged by the siege engines. They poured into the outer village like water through a broken dam, cutting off the retreat route for a dozen Kalar defenders. Kaelin saw what was happening and made an instant decision. Instead of continuing the retreat to safety, he turned and charged back toward the trapped men. "This way," he shouted, cutting down an enemy soldier who was about to strike down young Tam. "Stay together and follow me." What followed was the most desperate fighting of the day. Kaelin led the trapped defenders in a running battle through the streets of their own village, using every doorway and corner as cover. His knowledge of combat tactics and the other men's knowledge of the local terrain combined to keep them alive as they fought their way toward safety. But the Iron Fist soldiers were determined to finish what they had started. More and more of them poured into the outer village, and Kaelin's small group found themselves surrounded with no clear path to the inner defenses. An enemy spear caught Kaelin in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a stone wall. Blood ran down his arm and his sword arm went numb. "Keep moving," he gasped to the others even as he struggled to stay on his feet. Tam, the young man who had been so frightened during training, proved his courage now. He stayed behind to help Kaelin while the others made their escape. "I'm not leaving you," the boy said simply. Together, they held off the attackers for crucial minutes while their companions reached safety. Kaelin fought with his left hand, his right arm hanging useless at his side. Tam found strength he didn't know he had, his sword moving with desperate efficiency. Just when it seemed they would be overwhelmed, arrows began falling among the Iron Fist soldiers. The other defenders had reached the inner walls and were providing covering fire for their rescue. Kaelin and Tam made their final dash to safety, running through a hail of enemy weapons. They collapsed inside the inner defenses just as the great gate slammed shut behind them. The outer village was lost, but the people were safe. For now, as Arya tended to Kaelin's wounded shoulder, she could see the pain in his eyes, not from the injury, but from what they had been forced to give up. "We'll get it back," she whispered to him. Kaelin looked at her with eyes that had seen too much war. "Maybe, but first we have to survive the night. They'll attack again soon, and next time they won't underestimate us." Outside the inner walls, the Iron Fist celebrated their victory by burning everything in the outer village they couldn't use. The smoke rose into the evening sky like a funeral pyre for the peaceful life the Kalar people had once known. The real battle was just beginning. Night brought no rest for the defenders. The Iron Fist had learned from their first assault and were preparing something new. Through the darkness, the Kalar people could hear the sound of axes cutting wood and hammers building siege equipment. The enemy was getting ready for a final, overwhelming attack. Kaelin sat propped against a wall in the village's small healing house, his shoulder wrapped in bandages. The wound was deep but clean. It would heal if he lived long enough. The bigger problem was that they had lost nearly a third of their fighters in the day's battle. "We can't win a direct fight," he told Chief Theron during their emergency war council. "They still outnumber us 4-1, and now they're angry. Tomorrow they'll throw everything they have at these walls." Around the circle, the faces of the remaining leaders showed the strain of the day's losses. Elder Bram had taken an arrow through his leg. Captain Jorik, their best scout, had burns on his hands from fighting the fires in the outer village. Everyone was wounded, exhausted, or both. "What other options do we have?" Theron asked, though he feared the answer. "We change the rules of the fight. Instead of waiting here for them to break down our walls, we take the battle somewhere else. Somewhere that gives us the advantage." Arya leaned forward from her place near the door. She wasn't officially part of the War Council, but her father had stopped trying to keep her away from these discussions. "You're talking about the old caves," she said quietly. "The ones behind Eagle's Gate?" Kaelin nodded. "Your ancestors chose this location for their village because it was defensible. But the most defensible position isn't the village itself, it's the network of caves and tunnels that runs through these mountains." He struggled to his feet and moved to the rough map they had drawn on the wall. "Look at the terrain. If we can draw them into the narrow passages, their numbers become a disadvantage instead of an advantage. They can only send a few men at a time, and we know every twist and turn." "You're talking about abandoning the village completely," Elder Bram said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Leaving everything our people have built." "I'm talking about saving lives," Kaelin replied. "Buildings can be rebuilt. People can't be brought back from the dead." The debate that followed was painful but necessary. Some wanted to make a final stand in the village, dying with honor rather than skulking in caves like animals. Others supported Kaelin's plan, understanding that survival was more important than pride. Finally, Chief Theron made the hardest decision of his life. "We'll do it. But not everyone. Some of us will stay here and make them think we're still defending the village. The rest will move to the caves and prepare the real defense." It was a desperate plan, but desperation sometimes bred the most creative solutions. While the adults argued strategy, Arya had been thinking about something else. She knew these mountains better than anyone, including paths that even Kaelin hadn't discovered. If they were going to fight a guerrilla war in the caves, she could provide advantages that no one else could offer. "I want to help," she said suddenly, interrupting the discussion. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to look at the chief's daughter. "Arya, we've talked about this," her father began. "No, you've decided about this without listening to me. I know passages through these mountains that could let us move our fighters behind enemy lines. I know hiding places where we could store weapons and supplies. Most importantly, I know escape routes that could save lives if something goes wrong." Kaelin studied her face carefully. "This isn't a game. If you come with us, you'll see things that will change you forever. People will die, possibly people you care about. Are you prepared for that?" Arya met his gaze steadily. "People are already dying. At least this way I can help prevent some of those deaths." The argument continued for another hour, but in the end, necessity won again. They needed every advantage they could get, and Arya's knowledge of the terrain was too valuable to waste. The evacuation began before dawn. Moving wounded fighters and essential supplies through mountain paths in darkness was dangerous work. But it was better than trying to do it under enemy observation. Arya led the first group, carrying a torch to light the way through passages that hadn't been used in generations. Behind her came the wounded, including Kaelin, who insisted he could still fight, despite his injured shoulder. The caves they reached were larger than most people realized. A whole network of chambers and tunnels that their ancestors had used as emergency shelters during harsh winters or earlier wars. The air was cool and damp, and their voices echoed strangely in the stone passages. "This will work," Kalen said, examining the natural defensive positions. "We can hold these passages with a handful of men, and they'll never be able to bring their full force to bear." While the evacuation continued, a small group of volunteers remained in the village to maintain the illusion that everyone was still there. They kept fires burning, moved around visibly on the walls, and made as much noise as possible to convince the Iron Fist that nothing had changed. It was a dangerous job. When the final attack came, these brave men would have to escape quickly or be overwhelmed. By mid-morning, the Iron Fist was ready for their assault. General Vex had brought up massive battering rams and tall siege towers. He was clearly planning to end the siege with one overwhelming attack. The assault began with another shower of fire arrows, followed immediately by the siege engines. The battering rams hammered against the gates while the towers rolled forward, carrying soldiers who could climb over the walls. But this time, the defense was different. Only a few dozen Kalar fighters remained in the village, and they fought a running retreat, giving ground slowly but steadily. To the attackers, it looked like the defenders were finally breaking under pressure. "They're collapsing," General Vex shouted to his officers. "Press the attack. Don't let any of them escape." The Iron Fist poured into the village like a flood, expecting to find cowering families and desperate fighters making their last stand. Instead, they found mostly empty buildings and a handful of defenders who seemed to be retreating toward the mountain paths. "It's a trap," warned one of Vex's lieutenants. But the general was already committed to the attack. "Of course it's a trap, but they're out of options. We'll follow them into whatever hole they're hiding in and finish this." The pursuit began immediately. Iron Fist soldiers charged up the mountain paths, following what they thought were fleeing villagers. The rocky terrain slowed them down, but they had overwhelming numbers and confidence in their victory. What they found instead was Eagle's Gate, the narrow passage that Arya had identified weeks earlier as the perfect defensive position. The passage was barely wide enough for 3 men to walk side by side, with steep stone walls rising on both sides. It twisted and turned so that no one could see very far ahead or behind, and it was full of Kalar defenders who knew exactly what they were doing. The first Iron Fist soldiers to enter the passage walked into a perfectly prepared ambush. Arrows came from hidden positions in the rock walls. Boulders, carefully positioned weeks earlier, came crashing down to block the path behind them. Men who thought they were chasing defeated enemies found themselves trapped in a stone corridor with nowhere to run. "Now they learn what it means to fight us on our terms," Kalen said grimly, drawing his sword with his good arm. The battle in Eagle's Gate was unlike anything that had come before. The Iron Fist's advantages, their numbers, their cavalry, their siege engines, were useless in the narrow stone passage. They could only send a few men forward at a time, and each one had to face defenders who knew every rock and crevice. But the Iron Fist were still dangerous fighters, and they adapted quickly to the new situation. They began using their shields to form a protective wall, advancing slowly but steadily through the passage. "We can't hold them forever," Arya whispered to Kalen during a brief lull in the fighting. "We don't need to hold them forever, just long enough to make them bleed for every step. Every man they lose here is one less they can send against other villages." The fighting continued all day, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Kalar defenders used their knowledge of the terrain to strike and fade, appearing from hidden positions to attack and then disappearing before the enemy could respond. But slowly, inevitably, the Iron Fist's superior numbers began to tell. They lost many men, but they had many men to lose. The defenders lost fewer, but they had fewer to begin with. By evening, it was clear that Eagle's Gate couldn't be held much longer. "Time for the next phase," Kalen told Arya. "Show me those secret passages you mentioned." What happened next would become the stuff of legend among the mountain people for generations to come. As darkness fell over the mountains, Arya led Kalen and a small group of their best fighters through passages that existed only in the oldest stories of her people. These tunnels had been carved by ancient streams and widened by generations of her ancestors, who had used them as escape routes during the worst of times. "My grandmother told me about these when I was a child," Arya whispered as they moved single file through a tunnel so narrow they had to turn sideways. She said the mountain spirits had made them for the Kalar people to use when all hope seemed lost. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of battle continuing at Eagle's Gate. The remaining defenders were fighting desperately to hold the passage, buying time for this desperate plan to work. Kaelin's shoulder throbbed with each step, but he pushed the pain aside. Everything depended on the next few hours. If this plan failed, the Kalar people would be scattered to the winds and the Iron Fist would continue their campaign of destruction unchecked. The tunnel opened onto a ledge high above the enemy camp. From this position, they could see the entire Iron Fist army spread out below them like a dark stain on the land. Cooking fires dotted the darkness and guards walked patrol routes between the tents. Most importantly, they could see that General Vex had committed almost all of his forces to the attack on Eagle's Gate. The camp below was guarded by maybe 50 men, nothing compared to the thousands who were grinding their way through the mountain passage. "This is insane," muttered Davin, Chief Theron's nephew. "There are still too many of them." "Not if we do this right," Kaelin replied, studying the layout of the enemy camp. "We're not trying to defeat their whole army. We're trying to cut off the head of the snake." He pointed to the largest tent in the center of the camp. "That's where their general will be. If we can capture or kill him, their command structure falls apart. An army without leadership is just a mob." The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. They would split into 3 groups, attack the camp from different directions simultaneously, and fight their way to the command tent in the confusion. It required perfect timing, complete surprise, and more luck than anyone had a right to expect. But sometimes desperate times called for impossible plans. Arya was assigned to the group that would attack from the west, using her knowledge of the terrain to guide them down a steep cliff face that the enemy would never expect anyone to climb. Kaelin would lead the main assault from the north, while Tam, the young man who had proven his courage in the village, would bring the 3rd group from the east. "Remember," Kaelin told them before they separated, "we're not trying to hold the camp. Get in, cause as much chaos as possible, and get to that command tent. Once we've dealt with their general, we disappear back into the mountains." The attack began at midnight, when the enemy guards were tired and their attention was focused on the distant sounds of battle from Eagle's Gate. Arya's group struck first, appearing out of the darkness like vengeful spirits. They moved through the western edge of the camp, setting fire to supply wagons and cutting the ropes that held the horses. The animals scattered in panic, adding to the confusion. The alarm was raised within minutes, but by then Kaelin's group was already fighting their way through the northern section of the camp. The Iron Fist soldiers, roused from sleep, struggled to organize a defense against attackers they couldn't see clearly in the darkness. "To the general's tent," Kaelin shouted, cutting down a guard who tried to block his path. The battle in the camp was chaos. Shadows fought shadows by firelight. Friend and foe were hard to distinguish in the darkness, and the Iron Fist soldiers couldn't use their superior numbers, effectively because they couldn't tell where the attacks were coming from. Tam's group had reached the eastern edge of the camp and was fighting their way toward the center when disaster struck. A group of enemy officers, better armed and trained than the common soldiers, formed a defensive line around the command tent. "We can't break through," one of Tam's men gasped, blood running from a cut on his forehead. But Tam had learned more than just sword fighting from Kaelin. He had learned to think tactically, to find solutions when direct force wasn't enough. "We don't need to break through," he said. "We just need to distract them." While his men continued their frontal assault, drawing the officers' attention, Tam slipped around the back of the command tent. His heart pounded as he cut through the canvas wall with his knife, knowing that everything depended on what he found inside. General Vex was there, as expected, but he wasn't cowering in fear. The scarred commander was calmly putting on his armor, preparing to join the battle personally. "Impressive," Vex said when he saw Tam emerge through the hole in the tent wall. "I didn't think mountain peasants had this kind of courage." The general drew his sword, a blade that was longer and heavier than anything Tam had ever faced. But the young man had learned something important during these terrible days. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what was necessary despite the fear. The fight was brief, but fierce. Vex was skilled and experienced, but Tam was fighting for everything he loved. When it ended, the general lay motionless on the ground and Tam stood over him, bleeding from several wounds but still alive. The death of their commander broke the Iron Fist's will to fight. Without Vex's iron discipline holding them together, the army began to fall apart. Some soldiers fled immediately. Others fought on for a while but without coordination or clear objectives. By dawn, the Iron Fist was in full retreat, leaving behind their dead, their equipment, and their reputation for invincibility. At Eagle's Gate, the defenders couldn't believe what they were hearing. The sounds of battle from below had changed from organized attack to chaotic retreat. Enemy soldiers were running past the entrance to the passage, no longer interested in fighting trapped mountain people. "They're running," Chief Theron said in amazement. "They're actually running." It took hours for the full story to emerge. When Kalen's strike team finally returned to the caves, they brought news that seemed too good to be true. The Iron Fist was broken. Their general was dead. The survivors were scattering in all directions, more concerned with saving their own lives than continuing their campaign of conquest. The cost had been heavy. Of the 30 fighters who had participated in the camp raid, only 18 returned. Tam was among the survivors, but he bore wounds that would mark him for life. Several others wouldn't fight again for months, if ever, but they had won. Against all odds, against a vastly superior force, they had won. As word spread through the mountain caves where the civilians had been hiding, people began to emerge into the daylight. Children who had spent days in darkness blinked in the sunshine. Mothers searched for husbands and sons who had fought in the battle. The elderly gave thanks to the spirits of their ancestors who they believed had watched over them. In the village below, smoke still rose from the buildings that had been burned, but the structures could be rebuilt. The important thing was that the people had survived. Chief Theron stood in the ruins of his village's main square, looking around at the damage the Iron Fist had caused. It would take years to repair everything, but they would have those years. They would have the chance to rebuild, to raise their children, to continue the traditions that made them who they were. Kalen sat on a broken wall nearby, his wounded shoulder finally being treated properly by the village healer. The pain was intense, but it was nothing compared to the relief of knowing that the threat was over. "You did something incredible," Theron said to him. "My people owe you a debt that can never be repaid." Kalen shook his head wearily. "We all did something incredible. Your people fought like lions and they never gave up hope even when everything seemed lost." As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the full extent of their victory became clear. The Iron Fist was finished as a fighting force. Word would spread to other villages and tribes that this supposedly invincible army had been defeated by mountain people who refused to surrender their freedom. But for now, there was work to be done. The wounded needed care, the dead needed to be honored, and the long process of rebuilding would soon begin. The battle was over, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold. 3 days after the battle, the Kalar people gathered in the sacred grove where their ancestors had held ceremonies for hundreds of years. The ancient trees formed a natural circle, their branches reaching toward the sky like prayers made of wood and leaves. This was where the most important moments in their tribe's history were marked and remembered. Chief Theron stood at the center of the grove, wearing the ceremonial robes that had been passed down through generations of leaders. The fabric was old and faded, but it carried the weight of tradition and the authority of his bloodline. Around him, the entire surviving population of the tribe had assembled. Warriors still bearing fresh bandages from battle, mothers holding children who had hidden in caves for days, elders who had lived through other troubles but nothing quite like this. The ceremony began with the ritual honoring of the dead. 23 Kalar fighters had given their lives to defend their homeland. Each name was spoken aloud, followed by a moment of silence that seemed to echo through the forest. Families wept for sons, husbands, and fathers who would never return home, but their grief was mixed with pride. These men had died as heroes, saving everything their people held dear. When the remembrance was complete, Chief Theron turned his attention to the living. One by one, he called forward the warriors who had shown exceptional courage during the battle. Some received new weapons to replace ones they had broken in combat. Others were given places of honor in the village guard. All were acknowledged as defenders of the people, but Kalen remained at the back of the gathering, preparing to slip away quietly. His shoulder was healing and he had already stayed longer than he originally intended. His own people would be wondering what had happened to him, and he felt it was time to return home. He had taken only a few steps toward the forest path when Chief Theron's voice stopped him. Kalen, of the Windbrook tribe. Everyone turned to look at the stranger, who had appeared in their darkest hour. He walked back to the center of the grove, feeling the weight of all those eyes upon him. "You came to us as a warning messenger," Theron said, his voice carrying clearly through the trees. "You could have delivered your message and left. You had no obligation to our people, no oath binding you to our cause, but you chose to stay." The chief paused, looking around at the faces of his people. Some of these men and women had initially distrusted the outsider. Now they watched him with respect and gratitude. "You trained our fighters when they knew nothing of real warfare. You planned our defense when we had no strategy. You led our most dangerous missions when others hesitated. Most importantly, you never asked for anything in return." Kalen shifted uncomfortably. He had never been good with praise or ceremony. "I did what anyone would do in the same situation." "No," Theron replied firmly. "You did what a true warrior does, what someone with honor and courage does. And that is why what happens next must happen." The chief walked to where his daughter stood among the women of the tribe. Arya wore a simple dress of blue cloth, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had proven her worth in the most difficult circumstances. She met her father's eyes without flinching, knowing what he was about to say. "The greatest treasure of any chief is his family," Theron continued, his voice growing more solemn. "The greatest honor he can bestow is to share that treasure with someone worthy of it." The grove fell completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting for the words that would change everything. "Kalen of the Windbrook tribe, you alone defended our lands when others would have fled. You alone stood between our people and destruction. You saved not just our lives, but our way of life, our freedom, our future." Theron's voice grew stronger with each word. "I give you my daughter as wife, for you alone defended our lands." A murmur ran through the crowd. This was unprecedented in the history of their people. Chiefs did not give their daughters in marriage to strangers, no matter how heroic their actions might be. Marriage alliances were carefully planned political arrangements, not rewards for battlefield courage. But these were not normal times. And Kalen was not a normal stranger. All eyes turned to the man who had saved their village. Kalen stood frozen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered to him. In his culture, marriage was a sacred bond that united not just two people but two families, two bloodlines, two futures. To be offered the chief's daughter was an honor beyond anything he had ever imagined. But more than that, it was a choice that would change his entire life. He looked at Arya, trying to read her expression. Marriage by parental arrangement was common among their people, but he needed to know how she felt about this decision that was being made for her. Her eyes met his across the grove, and in them he saw something that made his heart race. Not resignation or duty, but hope, perhaps even joy. "Chief Theron," Kalen said carefully, "this honor is greater than I deserve, but such a decision affects more than just myself." "What does your daughter say?" This question caused another murmur among the watchers. It was unusual for a man to ask the woman's opinion in such matters, especially in front of the entire tribe. Arya stepped forward, her chin raised with the confidence that had made her such a valuable ally during the battle. "I say that my father is wise to recognize true worth when he sees it. I say that a man who would risk his life for strangers will protect his own family with even greater devotion. I say that I would be honored to accept this offer." The formality of her words couldn't hide the emotion behind them. During the long days of preparation and fighting, she had come to know Kalen's character. She had seen his courage, his wisdom, his dedication to protecting innocent people. More than that, she had felt the connection growing between them, a bond forged in shared danger and mutual respect. Elder Bram stepped forward, his leg still bandaged from his war wound, but his voice strong. "This union must be blessed by the spirits of our ancestors. Do we have their permission to join these two houses?" It was an ancient ritual, rarely used in modern times. The elder threw a handful of sacred herbs onto the ceremonial fire at the center of the grove. The flames flared green and gold, and a sweet smoke rose into the still air. "The spirits approve," Bram announced with satisfaction. "Let the joining be prepared." What followed was a celebration unlike any the Kalar people had seen for generations. Despite the recent battle, despite their losses, Despite the work of rebuilding that lay ahead, they threw themselves into preparing for a wedding that would be remembered for decades. The women of the tribe worked together to create a wedding dress for Arya, using the finest cloth they had saved from the destruction. The men prepared a feast from their carefully hoarded stores of food and wine. Children gathered flowers from the mountain meadows to decorate the ceremony site, but perhaps most importantly, messengers were sent to neighboring tribes with news of the victory over the Iron Fist and invitations to the wedding celebration. This would be more than just a marriage ceremony. It would be a declaration that the Keller people had not just survived but emerged, stronger than ever. Kaelin spent the 3 days before the wedding in a state of amazed gratitude. Everything he had lost when the Iron Fist destroyed his brother's village was being restored in a different form. He was gaining not just a wife but an entire new family, a new home, a new purpose in life. The night before the ceremony, he sat alone on the hillside above the village, looking up at the stars and thinking about the strange path that had led him here. He had set out seeking revenge against the Iron Fist for his brother's death. Instead, he had found something infinitely more valuable. Footsteps approached through the darkness, and Arya appeared beside him. "Tomorrow our lives change forever," she said softly, settling herself on the grass beside him. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She considered the question seriously. Not afraid, excited, nervous maybe, but not afraid. "What about you?" Kaelin looked at this remarkable woman who had proven herself as both a warrior and a leader. "I'm grateful," he said simply, "more grateful than I have words to express." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead and knowing that their story was just beginning. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, as if the mountain spirits themselves had ordered perfect weather for this historic occasion. The sacred grove had been transformed overnight into something magical. Flowers hung from every branch, their colors creating a natural cathedral of beauty. Ancient stones had been arranged in patterns that told the story of the Kalar people's history, from their first arrival in these mountains to this moment of new beginnings. By mid-morning, people began arriving from neighboring tribes. The news of the Iron Fist's defeat had spread quickly through the mountain communities, and everyone wanted to see the heroes who had accomplished the impossible. But more than that, they came to witness a wedding that would unite two tribes and create new bonds of friendship and alliance. Chief Theron stood near the ceremonial altar, wearing robes that had belonged to his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather. The fabric was ancient, but the gold thread embroidered into it still caught the sunlight like fire. He watched the gathering crowd with satisfaction, knowing that this ceremony would strengthen his people's position for generations to come. In her father's house, Arya prepared for the most important day of her life. The women of the tribe surrounded her, each contributing something to make her ready. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of their combined skills, white as mountain snow, decorated with silver threads that traced patterns of leaves and birds. Around her neck she wore the ceremonial necklace that had been worn by chiefs' daughters for 200 years. But despite all the traditional finery, Arya felt like a different person than she had been just weeks earlier. The battle had changed her, shown her strength she didn't know she possessed. She was no longer just the chief's daughter. She was a woman who had helped plan military strategy, who had led people through dangerous mountain passes, who had proven that courage had nothing to do with gender. "You look like a queen," said her cousin Mira, adjusting the final details of the dress. "I feel like myself," Arya replied, and somehow that was the greatest compliment she could give to her reflection in the polished bronze mirror. Meanwhile, Kaelin was undergoing his own preparation ritual with the men of the village. They had given him traditional Kalar wedding clothes, a deep blue tunic embroidered with silver, leather boots that had been crafted by their finest shoemaker, and a ceremonial sword that had once belonged to Theron's own father. "This sword has protected our people for 40 years, Tam told him as he helped fasten the weapon's belt. The young warrior bore new scars from the battle, but his eyes shone with pride at being chosen to assist in this ceremony. "Now it passes to you because you've proven yourself worthy of it." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. By giving Kaelin his father's sword, Chief Theron was publicly declaring that the stranger had become family, had earned the right to stand as protector of the Kalar people. As noon approached, the ceremony began with the ancient rituals that had been passed down through countless generations. Elder Bram led the opening prayers, calling on the spirits of the ancestors to witness this union and bless it with prosperity and happiness. The bride and groom approached the altar from opposite sides of the grove, walking slowly through the gathered crowd. Arya moved with grace and dignity, her head held high, acknowledging the smiles and good wishes of her people. Kaelin walked with the quiet confidence that had carried him through battles and challenges, but his eyes never left his bride's face. When they met at the center of the grove, Chief Theron stepped forward to perform the ceremony. His voice carried clearly through the forest as he spoke the words that would bind these two lives together. "Marriage is more than the joining of two people," he began. "It is the creating of new possibilities, new hopes, new futures. Today we witness not just the union of Kaelin and Arya, but the strengthening of bonds between all our mountain communities." The ceremony included rituals from both tribes, the exchange of rings made from silver mined in the Kalar Mountains, the sharing of wine from grapes grown in Windbrook valleys, and the binding of their hands with cords woven from fibers that came from both their homelands. But the most moving moment came when they spoke their personal vows to each other. Arya went first, her voice steady and clear. "Kaelin, you came to us as a stranger, but you became our defender, our teacher, our friend. You showed us that true strength comes not from the sword, but from the willingness to sacrifice for others. I promise to stand beside you in whatever challenges we face, to be your partner in building the life we both want, and to love you not just for what you've done, but for who you are." Kaelin's response was simpler but no less heartfelt. "Arya, you've shown me that courage comes in many forms. You've proven that wisdom is more valuable than weapons, that knowledge can be as powerful as strength. I promise to protect you and our future children with my life, to honor your people as my own, and to love you with everything I have to give." When Elder Bram declared them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the crowd could probably be heard in the next valley. People who had recently faced death together now celebrated new life and new hope. The feast that followed lasted well into the night. Tables had been set up throughout the grove, loaded with the best food that could be gathered on short notice. There was roasted meat, fresh bread, preserved fruits, and wines that had been saved for special occasions. Musicians played songs that had been passed down through generations, while children danced between the tables and adults told stories of the recent battle. But perhaps the most significant moment of the celebration came when the chiefs of the visiting tribes stood to offer their congratulations. One by one, they pledged friendship and mutual support to the Kalar people. The victory over the Iron Fist had not just saved one village, it had created new alliances that would help protect the entire region. "Today we have witnessed something extraordinary," declared Chief Gareth of the Stoneheart tribe. "We have seen that when good people stand together, no force of evil can overcome them. The Kalar people have shown us all what courage looks like." As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, Kaelin and Arya found themselves sitting together at the edge of the festivities, watching their people, for they were both their people now, enjoy this moment of joy after so much hardship. "What are you thinking about?" Arya asked, noting the thoughtful expression on her new husband's face. "I'm thinking about my brother," Kaelin replied softly. "He died because of the Iron Fist's cruelty. But if he hadn't died, I never would have followed them. I never would have come here, never would have met you or your people. I never would have found this new life." He paused, looking up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I can't say I'm glad he died, that would be wrong, but I think he would be happy to know that something good came from his sacrifice." Arya took his hand in hers, feeling the calluses from sword work and the newer scars from their recent battles. "The people he saved by your actions, the children who will grow up free because the Iron Fist was stopped here, they're his monument. That's how he'll be remembered." Around them, the celebration continued with music and laughter, but they were content to sit quietly together, thinking about the future they would build. There would be challenges ahead, there always were. The village needed to be rebuilt. Relationships with other tribes needed to be maintained, and somewhere out there, other threats might be gathering, but they would face those challenges together, as husband and wife, as partners in every sense of the word. They had proven that love could grow from respect and shared struggle, that two people from different backgrounds could create something stronger than either could achieve alone. As the night grew later and the guests began to drift back to their temporary camps, Kaelin and Arya walked hand in hand to their new home, a house that had been quickly rebuilt for them on the site where Kaelin had first taught her to fight with a sword. It seemed fitting that their married life should begin in the place where they had first learned to trust each other. Standing in the doorway, looking back at the village that was already beginning to show signs of recovery, Arya smiled at the man who had become her husband. "So what happens now?" she asked. Kaelin smiled back, pulling her closer. "Now we write the next chapter of the story. Together." And in the mountains above their village, where the ancient spirits of the Kalar people were said to dwell, the wind carried the sound of their laughter up toward the stars, a promise of hope and new beginnings that would echo through the valleys for generations to come. The story of their defense against the Iron Fist would be told and retold around campfires for years to come. But the real story, the story of two people who found love in the midst of war and built a life together based on mutual respect and shared courage, that story was just beginning.